I call the member for Indi.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In rising to speak on the Customs Amendment Anti-Dumping Improvements Bill 2011, I'd like to begin by indicating that the opposition will be giving its support to the government on this legislation. And for the record, I'd like to quickly restate some of what I've said in my second reading speech in August 2011 on a forerunner version of this bill. And that is that the Coalition is pleased to see the government accepting the need for change to Australia's anti-dumping system, for which key stakeholders have been calling for some time. It's good that something is finally being done about such problems. We're glad that the government's eventually responded to combined pressure from the Coalition, Senator Xenophon, industry groups, individual businesses and trade unions to make changes such as those that are enshrined through this bill, which include the introduction of a new appeals process to replace the existing appeals mechanism, establishment of the International Trade Remedies Forum, and the creation of new guidelines for extensions to be allowed in certain circumstances. And in principle, these are all sensible and practical changes. That said, I am a little unsure of exactly how long the process of delivering all of the government's 20-odd mooted changes is going to take, especially given that this is now the second tranche of legislation containing a combined total of 7 of the changes so far in the course of more than 6 months. And as a side note, and in perfectly good faith, I'd like to ask those opposite if they could indicate in one of their contributions in this debate exactly how many further tranches they expect to be regarding the foreshadowed changes to the anti-dumping regime, and also by what date they expect the last of the various bills into which they've codified the changes of June last year to come before the Parliament. It's not just the opposition that needs to know these matters, industry is needing to know the time frame as well. At this point in time, the answers to those questions are unclear, and I assume to everyone else who's following this debate too, they are unclear. At the very least, those of us on this side of the House would be grateful for clarification of whether the government still envisages that all of its measures will be implemented before the end of the financial year. As for the specific changes that are being legislated through this bill, we support the establishment of the International Trade Remedies Forum, and indeed the Coalition has said for a long time that industry must be given a much greater voice in articulating improvements to the system, and more to the point that its voice should be far more clearly heard. I'm going to reserve my full judgment on the success of the practical operation of the forum until we're a bit further down the track. But if we take the government at face value on this and accept that its intention is to genuinely bring together representatives from government and local industries, importers and unions, and give them a better say in identifying problems and suggesting future improvements to our national anti-dumping system, then it's certainly a step in the right direction. However, I'd like to add that it's not exactly ideal that the government convenes the opening meetings of the forum, gets the administrative niceties out of the way and begins the discussions, only to then uproot the process with a ministerial reshuffle that transfers the relevant front benches to a different part of the ministry and effectively forces everyone to start the process all over again, which, as I understand from a few quarters, is what seems to have happened. Not to mention that the Labor Party has obviously been plagued by even more intense internecine warfare since then, and one of the results of which will be that everyone now has to endure yet another ministerial reshuffle. In relation to the amendments that are being made to the rules and the guidelines surrounding extensions to investigation timelines, we do approve of those as well, and I do want to add, though, that it's vital that the government devotes great care to how and indeed how frequently these extensions are granted. Many parties in anti-dumping cases over the years have been intensely frustrated at the sheer length of time that it's taken to resolve some cases, and all the while incurred substantial financial costs as well, which is to say nothing of the damage in that relevant market. If the extensions allow for better and more accurate decision-making, then that's obviously a good thing. But if a greater number and a wider range of extensions are, and in and of themselves, potentially going to lead to unnecessary blowouts in the timeframes of investigations, and or be used as a cover in any way to avoid expediting decisions where they should be made more quickly, then that would represent a seriously undesirable development. I also want to stress much the same point in relation to the changes that are being introduced through this bill to the appeals process. And in a general sense, we are supportive of the changes the government has outlined. But I do recognise and appreciate that one of the things that the government says it's trying to do here is to raise the threshold for appeals to be instigated in the first place. But in expanding the scope of the appeal hearings and increasing the number of people responsible for overseeing them, I do want to sound the cautionary note, again, that the government will need to maintain a close watching brief to ensure this doesn't have the opposite effect to the one intended. There's wide recognition that there are currently a number of flaws in Australia's anti-dumping regime, and that unlike the systems in force in many other countries, it often works to the disadvantage of local industries and business. So on the basis that the intent of this bill is to make some sensible administrative changes, and on the assumption that the government will implement them effectively, a big assumption considering governance in the last couple of years, but nonetheless, assuming they will be implemented effectively, then the Coalition is happy to support its passage. But, and this is a significant but, I really can't let the occasion of this debate pass without expressing my disdain at the actions of the government in relentlessly using the issue of anti-dumping as the pretext for quite another unsavoury and desperate set of attacks on the Leader of the Opposition and the Opposition generally during recent months, especially after the public release of our anti-dumping policy in November last year. Like everyone else, I obviously recognise why the government thinks launching crazed attacks on the opposition might be its best form of defence at the moment, because the last thing they want to do is to be reminded of their own atrocious failures and dysfunction. And in the area of industry policy more specifically, they're desperate to make their absolutely miserable record and appalling disregard for Australian manufacturing vanish from view as swiftly as possible. It's obvious that there's significant internal division within the government on the subject of manufacturing, and it's no surprise in the circumstances to see backbenchers in manufacturing seats like the members for Wakefield and Govenrment all backing the member for Griffith as a better choice of leader than the member for Lalor. And it's also no surprise in the circumstances to see policy making increasingly be more about shrill statements than sensible manufacturing policy. It's why we've seen the ludicrous party political rhetoric from the Labor Party on the subject of the car industry lately, the serial hypocrisy and arrogance of people like the Prime Minister, like Senator Carr, and the member for Govenrment, Mr Cheeseman, who prey on the fears and anxieties of car workers in Geelong before elections by spreading all manner of misinformation about the Coalition's policies. And then breaking billions of dollars worth of their own promises after those elections, and that hypocrisy is indeed breathtaking. I've still got a couple of copies of the edition of the Geelong Advertiser from mid-2010 that had Senator Carr and the member for Govenrment shamefully telling the community there how the Coalition was supposedly going to cripple Ford and cripple Geelong with the proposed cut to the Green Car Innovation Fund. And what happened? Overall, the Labor Party cut more than 3 times the amount of the saving that we suggested. Our suggested cut was $278 million, and then Labor ended up cutting the scheme by $885 million. And there has still been no apology, no contrition, no fessing up to the squalid deception and dirty tricks.
The member for Indi will resume her seat. The Parliamentary Secretary on a point of order.
The member for Indi should address her remarks to something that is remotely relevant to the bill that's before the House.
The The Parliamentary Secretary has a point. I invite the member for Indi to return her remarks to the Customs Amendment Anti-Dumping Improvements Bill.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And anti-dumping is critical to the manufacturing sector that is facing all sorts of challenges, including that of sovereign risk due to broken promises. And in that environment, it is important to canvass the issue of broken promises and how that impacts on the viability, the future viability of the manufacturing sector, and what role anti-dumping can take, because we have seen 130,000 workers in Australian manufacturing lose their jobs since mid-2008. And there are other industries within manufacturing, many SMEs in food processing, in steel, in glass, in plastics, in chemicals, who are already surviving wafer-thin margins even before the government clubs them with ridiculous measures like the carbon tax, and they are very concerned about anti-dumping. And of course, we have had extensive discussions with them, and they are very keen to see the government's policy rolled out before they pass final judgment. But the government does have an obligation to explain their policies, to explain how and why, if policies are so good for manufacturing, it has provided over such a sustained burning of jobs in the manufacturing sector. Now, in the area of anti-dumping specifically, I haven't yet seen the latest iteration of Labor's talking points, but no doubt the member for Fraser will help us out and fulfil his trademark role in his party by parroting them dutifully word for word a bit later in this debate. The latest lot included things along the lines that apparently the Coalition's position was in, quote, fundamental breach of WTO obligations. And I think we're probably responsible for all sorts of manner of things. Insofar as I can make any sense of this ranting and raving, most of Labor's criticism has been directed at us because what we said in our policy was that we were determined where possible to make better use of preliminary affirmative determinations, and where appropriate, that we'd be active in applying them from the 60-day stage of investigations. This was enough. This was enough for Ministers O'Connor and Emerson to foam at the mouth about how allegedly irresponsible we were and how none of this was allowed under the WTO. In reality, what they were really angry about wasn't that anything we were suggesting was not compliant with the WTO rules. What bothered them, and what really got under their skin, was that what we'd proposed, the changes that we proposed, would go a long way toward creating a fundamental shift in thinking and emphasis in the way that Australia administers its national anti-dumping arrangements. Real reform, not tinkering around the edges. And I'm afraid that the government has been humiliated by its own words, because as it turns out, in their own policy document printed in June 2011, they said the following, and I quote, Mr Deputy Speaker, "By day 60, the earliest WTO consistent date a PAD can be considered, the relevant branch in Customs will eventually have verified the domestic industry's data and will have received data from the exporters." It goes on to say, "If the data submitted by the exporters shows evidence of dumping or subsidisation, this may be sufficient evidence on which to base a PAD prior to verification." And ironically enough, that material has also been subsequently reprinted in the explanatory memorandum for this bill. So at the same time, the Labor Party is admitting to the Parliament that preliminary affirmative determinations are expressly allowed at the 60-day stage and beyond. It's trying to hoodwink the public about the Coalition's policy and pretending otherwise. And of course, these kinds of double standards have been witnessed over and over again from this government, and it'll no doubt continue to happen over and over again, particularly now that the member for Layla has survived today as leader of the Labor Party. I'm hopeful that with a new Home Affairs Minister, we'll see a far more constructive and reasonable approach in the area of anti-dumping at the very least. I don't have high expectations. I'm just choosing this one area of policy, Mr Deputy Speaker, to see that perhaps we can get some greater consistency and honesty in the area of policy making in this regard. But for goodness sake, the rest of the members on the other side are meant to be part of a government, and it's long past the time when the Labor Party stopped making up nonsense, breaking promises, breaking faith with the Australian people, and trying to blame the opposition for its own internal dysfunction and disgraceful failings.